Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest in a series of webinars exploring leadership in extraordinary times, brought to you by the Side Business School at the University of Oxford. I'm Jonathan Reynolds. I'm an associate professor in retail marketing at the school, where I'm also a director of our Institute of Retail Management. I've been writing and researching about retailing for over 30 years. Today's webinar is aimed at exploring some of the extraordinary challenges facing luxury retailing internationally. And let's position this challenge, first of all. Here's a sector which thrives on personal service and customer contact, on delivering remarkable customer experiences. And yet, as some retail and leisure markets worldwide are slowly emerging from the lockdown imposed by the pandemic, they still often face severe mitigation measures, ranging from social distancing to significant store and shopping centre capacity caps, with queuing and face coverings as the new normal in many geographies. So what can we learn about the ways in which the luxury retail sector is adapting and responding? And what are the longer term implications for retail business models and indeed for consumer society itself? Now, to help me explore these and other questions, I'm really delighted to be joined in conversation by Scott Malkin. Scott's a founder and chairman of Value Retail, a company which specializes in the development and operation of luxury outlet shopping villages around the world, in partnership with some of the world's leading brands. Scott's also a member of Oxford Saïd's Global Leadership Council, as well as, I realised recently, co-owner of the New Islanders hockey team. We might get to talk about that, I guess, towards the end if time permits, and talk a bit about leisure and sport. And we'll be interested too in your questions and observations. What would you like to ask Scott? Please post your questions and we'll make sure we have time as we go through, and certainly at the end, to try and respond to as many as we can. So welcome, Scott. Great to see you. And for those unfamiliar with the history of the Bicester Village shopping collection, which is the heart of value retail, could you perhaps kick us off by describing the origins of the concept and your particular approach and philosophy towards luxury retailing?
Pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan. The image behind me, in fact, is of Bicester Village, which is located just down the road from Jonathan at Oxford. It's Oxford University, Oxford City, and it is the flagship, earliest and first project of the Bicester Village Shopping Collection, which is modeled, all of our projects, 9 in Western Europe, 2 in China, are modeled on a project we've developed called Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles, which was my first graduate training, as it were, in luxury and fashion retailing, when people were much more interested in big boxes with department store anchors and multiples filling in. And what we learned about fashion is that it is built around touristic qualities, in fact, around tourism, and that it was really where the most innovative and constantly challenging events were taking place. And then with fashion, one really needed to run a shopping precinct or a venue in the tradition of the great carriage trade department stores, the Harrods and Selfridges models. And we further learned, so constantly re-merchandising, constantly working with the brands, constantly driving the performance of the quality of the experience. And then we discovered, if one could get all those pieces right, don't think of a process of creating shopping precincts as a manufacturing logic. Think of it as a cultivation and long-term organic evolution, and make places special and keep reinventing them. And if one thinks about, again, a traditional great department store, Harrods and Selfridges, the sales keep going up. They haven't been flat for the last 50 years. The stores are emporia. They change with the times. They change with the customers. But they remain setting the standard. They remain in the vanguard of what people want. And it's something about embracing the consumer and respecting the brands. So we pursued that. Bicester Village was the first of our 11 projects. We have kept control of it, kept ownership of it, and we are constantly redefining it, reinventing it. As recently as last week when we reopened Bicester Village, we introduced, as we have done in all of our projects now, digital queuing. So a day or two of practice for the brands, because they're the ones who have to replace the queue outside their front doors, which, by the way, they tend to think is a very cool thing. They have a lot of people waiting to get in, clamoring and desirous, but not necessarily the safest thing in an era of social distancing. And now it's a QR code. It's an invitation time to show up at the door. And interestingly, we discover that we have discovered that those who come through the QR code digital queuing rather than just walking across the transom more casually spend more. Yep. So it's a more defined, more directed shopper who gets to the store and comes into the store. So in a funny way, we reflect perhaps a general trend, which is, on the one hand, people glad to be released from confinement, but on the other hand, people saying, well, we've tested the mechanisms, some of them increasingly efficient, that provide alternatives to personal visits or physical experience. And now we want to benefit from personal experience, but of a flagship quality. So our view is, and I think increasingly the view of fashion and luxury brands, is any physical touch point for the brand has to be of flagship quality, whether it's at an airport. People will go back to airports. Shopping will continue to be vibrant in airports, or a prime pitch, or a luxury fashion department store. Those will exist as the chains themselves shrink away. Karstadt just announced 82 stores to close. Macy's will close hundreds of stores in the US. And finally, it turns out that our channel, which is really devoted to, on the one hand, the traditional purpose of a correct proposition, a correct method for selling authentic surplus merchandise, an open-air pedestrian street of boutiques modeled on Two Radio Drive's logic, then very much appealing to the traveling luxury consumer, as Angela Ahrens, when she was running Burberry, termed that global traveler. And increasingly, we've now got the data to support this and help us to refine this thinking, customer acquisition for the brands, because it turns out that people who are younger in particular, and all the brands want to capture new and younger customers, people who are exploring when on holiday, when traveling, perhaps aspirational but not yet full-fledged, full-price consumers, can discover the brands, can build relationships with specific brands, and can become new clients for those brands. And it turns out that actually, of the sales that occur in our boutiques and our villages, a high percentage of those customers become full price shoppers for the brand. Of course, the brand can tell from the credit card tracking whether these are existing customers, and in fact, they virtually never are. Right. So suddenly we're in customer acquisition, which for brands turns out not only, of course, to be their lifeblood, but also they have discovered, particularly the digital native brands, they can't get new customers online on an affordable cost basis. What they call the Facebook Google tax means that, with a few exceptions, sometimes those are momentary exceptions, they can't build enough mass to support their overheads to run the business properly. So they've all started backing into opening physical stores as well. COVID interrupts all of this. It accelerates a number of things that were already happening. Those sometimes sadly familiar high street or mainstream names that were dead man walking, or closer to being dead or dying at the moment. But the thing that is so exciting about fashion, and particularly the high end of fashion, is that it's a high wire act. Regardless of the moment, there's always the weather, events, travel, volcanoes erupting between North America and Europe, whatever it happens to be. And the operators of these brands have to be agile. They are. It's truly an entrepreneurial culture, and historically, it's been one led by autocrats. Increasingly, it's one led by management teams of people well trained from places like Said.
I mean, it's a great introduction to the topic, and there's so many places we could dive in. Let me perhaps start with that comment around the agility of the luxury brand, and the need to take a global view on these things. And if you think about your own shopping collection, as you say, you're in a number of markets in Europe and in China. That must have put you in a really unique position to see the early impact of the pandemic. If you take a step back a few months, what were your priorities for the business as you saw the pandemic start to take hold in China and then spread kind of west?
It sounds cliched, but it's true. One first thinks of one's staff, the safety,
Yep.
the practical issues, and of course we've got thousands of people working for us, so that's thousands of families. And we did the calculation, in effect, between the boutiques and our direct employees, it's 25,000 people who, if they don't get paid, don't eat. Some government support here and there, but in the early days, and in China, for example, the cycle went so quickly that they never got a furlough logic. Things in China move at an incredible pace, and the COVID experience is no different.
Yeah.
So the first was safety and stability for our people. The second, obviously, the act of closing the villages. We closed all 11. Is demanding. And then the next thing we focused on was our relationship with our brands. We really see ourselves as partners with the brands. We take a turnover royalty or a percentage of sales royalty. We don't charge a traditional rent. We don't have we have licensing contracts like a department store. We don't charge a shopping center type rent. That thinking comes substantially from my second leg of my training in retail and fashion with the late Marvin Traub, who invented modern sales and was truly a merchant in his thinking, and who wrote about our business in his book, actually, his last book, and talked about how the ideas about our focus on experience could be translated to other elements of the retail economy, that they were not logically limited to the outlet channel, high-end outlet channel of distribution our villages represent. So the second thing was with the brands, and what we decided straight off was we would not charge the brands anything while we were closed, and therefore while they were closed, which I think it remains unique. We didn't ask for anything back. We just said, we're in this together. Yeah. We luckily, it's a quite painful thing to do organizationally and financially. While we were not charging them anything, we were cutting our own payrolls and staffing.
Yeah. That's very, very unlike the situation we see in many markets now, where you've got developers and shopping center owners and owed rent by retail tenants and so on, who are simply not finding a way forward together.
It goes all the way down the chain, doesn't it? So in the end, it goes to the widows and the orphans who invest in the insurance companies and the pension funds, who in turn are collecting the rents, or the banks who are collecting the rents, and it runs all the way to government, and if government doesn't say to those owners of assets, in some form, will supplement your income streams, then who gets squeezed? Typically, somewhere down the chain, someone gets squeezed.
Yeah. We
were lucky. We were in a position where we could absorb the pain. The shock to the system was in China 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. In Europe, it's been more 2 months. The bet was, when we came back, would we come back in a vibrant way? Clearly, the long-haul traveling luxury consumer isn't traveling because no one's traveling. On the other hand, we are built around and adjoining hub cities. We serve hub cities. So that consumer is already in the cities where we are located, not traveling anywhere else. So our goal now, and it's working, is to speak to that consumer, make that person feel special and welcome. In China, where our proposition would appear almost uniquely, deliver the real offer from Europe to China don't deliver the Chinese version or don't deliver a watered down version.
Absolutely.
We're now getting people who would go to Europe for travel who can't because the barriers to travel are real, and who say, I can find Singapore in Shanghai, I can find Dubai in Shanghai, I can find an experience like Hudson Yards in New York in Shanghai, but I can't find real European quality experiences in Shanghai. I find fake versions of Europe that I know aren't the real thing because I've been there. I'm sophisticated enough to know the difference. So suddenly we're getting people coming to us word of mouth, and we had one chap come the other day and spend $50,000 in an afternoon. And that's, I'm sure in his mind, that's money he would have spent in Paris, London, or New York on some kind of trip. And instead he's spending it at home, but with us. So this idea that the global positioning for brands has to be matched by the service providers, which is what any real estate operator is simply serving the brands. And in turn, how to do that, because it's a nightmare for the brands or for us. That's one of the big challenges going forward, how to do that and get the costs in line such that one can stay in business.
Yeah. Now, I'm told we've got about 150 countries amongst in our audience, so it's a really global conversation that we're having, and that really, leads me on to think more positively about some of the things you've started to say around the recovery and the reopening. You've also been able to observe consumer reactions as lockdowns around the world are gradually lifted. Have you seen any common patterns? Have you seen any differences internationally? I mean, I'm reminded that we have this phrase "revenge shopping," where people kind of suddenly released from lockdown, kind of hit the malls. I was talking to a colleague in Malaysia who's going through that sort of experience. And if we look at China, I think Hermes was reporting they did, the day it reopened in April, they did nearly $3 million in sales. But how durable is this bounce back to your mind?
I'm sure that's the right question, Jonathan. There was pent up demand. I would say we are a good indicator in certain respects, and possibly not the best evidence in others, because it seems consistently that there's an enthusiasm for what we happen to provide, which is open air in the countryside, not in the urban core, surface parking. People drive themselves or arrive on their own terms, depart on their own terms. So there's a sense of choice and a sense of, which in some sense, in some logic, is a sustainability voice. Some idea that one is more at peace with the environment rather than at odds with the environment. And what we are finding is that we tend to come back faster than any traditional shopping centers would come back, and faster than full price is coming back. Really? I think the idea of an outing, our whole vision has been a day in the countryside, a break from what's normal. We don't sell convenience goods. We don't sell more affordable fashion pricing. We don't sell groceries. So it's really about a wander, a memory. Right? We're in the business of delivering memories. That's the gift you take home. You bought for a family member, a loved one, you bought for yourself. That item symbolizes the trip, the visit, the gesture. So we're trying to be a place where someone goes once a year, or maybe once in a lifetime, not once a week. What we're seeing in China is a sharp V recovery. We're ahead of last year in our numbers as of only 3 or 4 weeks after reopening. So there's a tentativeness where people test the water.
So you're seeing fewer people spending more generally, or how does that ratio work out?
That is broadly correct. But now in China, we're actually at similar visitation levels to before. So just as the UK today, just hours ago, has limited the distance requirements, reducing it 2 meters to a meter. That's happened in China. In China, there is a tradition of wearing masks, sanitary logic, but in fact, the China model, and in some other places in that part of the world, they've been stamping down on the illness versus trying to manage it. I think in the West, which is a much more porous infrastructure, it seems like countries are working more to to manage the flow, assuming a level of illness. And in fact, Neil Ferguson, a former Oxford University prof, just put a piece out on Bloomberg. He's at Stanford now, talking about I think it's the Chinese flu in the 50s, 58 under Eisenhower in the U.S. And he was writing about how the U.S. administration behaved then, and nobody talked about it. It was just a bad flu, and if there wasn't a hospitalization approach, there wasn't a national media coverage, there was a death toll that looks like, on an adjusted basis, it might be very similar to what's happening here. And the idea was that in those days, there were so many things one could catch that weren't vaccinated, where there were no vaccines, that it was just another obstacle to work around in one's life. Now, his argument is we're much more joined up through communications, but we're also much more built along the assumptions that there will be a vaccine and we should be cared for.
Yeah.
In the West, how people will gather, how they will behave in group settings will shift as the vaccines emerge. I know Oxford has one well on the road.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, to me, the interesting question is less what happens for the next 6 to 12 months before the vaccine is distributed in the first group of countries that receive it, and more how will behavior be different after there is a broad-based vaccine in existence.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. I mean, in fact, you're anticipating the questions here, because there's a question from one of the audience saying, how did China compare with the rest of the world pre-COVID in your business? And how much should we read into the bounce back that you've seen in China? Should we expect to see these kind of bounce backs? Have we seen it already in, for example, in your sites elsewhere in Europe, as well as in the UK?
So in Europe, we've been open 1 to 5 weeks, depending on the country. We run from Italy and Germany all the way through to the UK and obviously Bicester Village and Ireland. In our villages that are smaller in attendance numbers, we are actually, in that relatively short period, back to trading levels that are consistent with last year, which is extraordinary. Again, generally slower build of footfall, fewer people spending more, but the idea that we could be in 2 or 3 of our villages last week, we outperformed the year before, which is surprising for me. The villages that are larger in visitor numbers and have these social distancing requirements, they simply can't put through the same volume of guests. And so it's hard to tell what the real appetite is. The trading numbers are off against last year, but well ahead of what we projected in our recovery plan.
Yeah.
So I would say that for us, to the extent that, and I think again, we are an early indicator of what might be going on more broadly in these different Western European countries. For us, it looks like it may be optimistically and subject to whatever chaos emerges later in the year from coronavirus reasserting itself. We're a U rather than a V, whereas China, our experience is that it's been a V.
Interesting. I mean, you mentioned earlier on, the way you've been supporting your brand partners, sharing the financial pain, for example. You also mentioned earlier in our conversation that you're trying to reassure customers, and you mentioned digital queuing amongst other things. So, how have you worked to support your brand partners as they've reopened?
It's challenging. We're lucky because we have an unusually large complement of staff. So we hire primarily from fashion brands, and we take the view that, like Marvin Traub would have done at Bloomingdale's, or like Vittorio Radici was doing at Selfridges, or we're there to work with the brands and to help them maximize their presentation and their performance. So it's really not a rent collecting logic, and because we share in the performance and don't take a rent, and because the people working with the brands are from those brands, speak the language of those brands, it's worked pretty well historically. But the the reality is that there's so many moving pieces. The brands have such a complicated existence, and we have to, in essence, fight for their attention, fight for the bandwidth that they could make available, possibly for some other part of a complex business infrastructure to support their stores with us. Now, that could mean potentially asking the brand to allow us to go with brand executives to help select stock that works for the customer that's going to a particular village, rather than just a blind drop from a warehouse infrastructure. Or that could mean, and does mean, that we give our consent to how the brands present themselves and the visual merchandising, how they present their messaging and their displays in the windows of their boutiques. I would say that there are two contradicting forces. One of the brands that's just reopened in the UK, we are their number one store across all of the UK. So in theory, and we've got at Bicester Village, maybe we're at 50% plus or minus of the footfall of a year ago, 55% this past week. So in theory, that should be very good news. You should be excited to see that progress and work with us. The bad part is that the rest of their UK estate is a bit of a disaster. They have a million things going on, and it's very hard for them to adjust. Peacetime generals are not necessarily the best wartime generals.
Yep.
And in trying to adjust, there's a temptation for them to try to simplify and standardize. And suddenly we're being lumped in with stores that might not be open or might be trading at 5% of last year. We get a call from a guy in New York who says, here's our policy globally. He's got a big global brand. He's got 3,000 stores. He's making no distinction between a store he has with us in serving Paris or Milan and a store serving Kansas City or Chengdu. It's all just one. And but of course it can't work that way. But that's a starting point that is massively distracting. Yeah. And then you have to work with the local teams to, in a sense, get around the obstacles.
I'd love to come back to that point about leadership and the importance of the local teams as we get through the conversation. Can I go back to the measures that you've taken? There's a question here from the audience. What has it been like trying to control crowds and taking on responsibility for the health of customers, in effect, when you allow them into your villages? We've seen some commentary about people think they got COVID in a particular place and resorting to legal means and so on. Is that a concern that you have?
It's quite intimidating, the issue generally. That's why we switched to digital queuing, because it by definition creates more space for people to move and to breathe. I think, and by the way, we take a regular stick from local press everywhere. Usually, it turns out, spouses and partners of people working in the boutiques in our villages who are themselves very afraid that their partner or spouse will come home and convey coronavirus delivered into the household. So there's this balancing act between trying to be orderly and trying to be flexible, because in every culture, in every mindset, things are different. In some markets, face masks are required. Others, they are regularly seen. Others, the UK, they're almost actively rejected. So what we can do is talk about talk about what we hope the guests will do, convey that on a website, convey that upon entrance, and we can talk to the brands about what we hope their staff will do, and we can talk about standards we hope they will embrace. But if a global brand says we're going to go 2 feet to the left, it's very hard to convince anybody at a local or regional level that actually that might be a bad choice in a specific case, because they're not flexible on that scale. So I would say that, back to the agility point, it's no different than anything else these brands face. how do they respond intelligently? And the more they try to simplify and standardize, the more, generally speaking, they get it wrong.
Yeah.
The idea that I once heard a stock market presentation from the then chief executive of Macy's as they merged and bought all these stores. And he was celebrating the fact that they were no longer shipping winter boots to Florida, stores in Florida. And the idea of inventory management and matching stock supply, because they'd centralized all the buying. There were no longer buyers, new individual stores and individual customers. That was obviously the moment where the department store model in the US was finished.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have algorithms they couldn't replace real people with AI, but the whole logic was to get rid of the people in order to simplify the back of house and reduce costs.
Yeah.
So that was one benchmark. Another moment was when Saks Off Fifth, which was a discount business, was opened 6 or 8 blocks from Saks Fifth Avenue in the center of Manhattan. Another clear marker. One can see these things as an expert, Jonathan. You get to look at them and write about them, but they tend not to be that surprising. But day to day, it's complicated, and certainly responding to coronavirus has been complicated.
Yeah, no, that's a nice segue into perhaps broadening this conversation out slightly and thinking about the wider retail sector internationally. I think we've both been guilty of using the kind of phrase that COVID has accelerated existing longer term trends. Are we being lazy in that respect? I've heard people say, well, we've done 3 years and 3 months in relation to online growth, for example. What are the features that have really accelerated, and which ones do you think will kind of bounce back to the way they were before, or is everything up for grabs?
I think it's relatively predictable, personally. First point is, nobody, starting with Amazon, makes money retailing online. The only people who make money retailing online, with 1 or 2 exceptions for specific reasons, are the brands who control their own inventory, sell from their own sites. But Net-a-Porter, Yoox, go down the list. In part, the costs are high and the returns are high, and which of course is one of the sources of cost. And in part, Amazon is modeled to make money from the membership fee and the ancillary costs, not the core proposition. Their goal is scale, and scale is delivered by great pricing and great efficiency. And it's not by chance that they're sitting in Seattle down the road from a company called Costco, which you will know, Jonathan, whose entire structure is that they make money from a membership fee and the float on your money until they pay for their goods. And everything else is delivered at cost, and they're ruthless about limiting costs. So it's a bit like education. Nobody's made money in commercialized education because the model of education, generally speaking, around the world has not been a profit-seeking model. So the competitive environment is distorted. So I think on the one hand, there's an economic proposition that is not completely obvious. If anyone were to say Amazon's gross sales are this and their profitability from retail as a percentage of the gross sales is so tiny, people would say, well, why did they bother? And there are lots of reasons that they should and did bother. And they're going to make a lot of money, but it's not going to be from retailing per se. So it's the use of data, it's the web services, it's a host of things, because they are extremely entrepreneurial and agile as they think about their model. But those who try to compete with Amazon are less believable than Amazon. So that's the first trend.
So there's a consolidation, in fact, we're talking about. So we're saying that actually the big platforms are going to be successful because they can make money from other things, but actually the go-it-alone competitors are going to have much more difficulty. So you have to kind of throw in your lot with a platform. Would that be fair?
And then if you do, as a purveyor, as a producer of goods, if you don't have your own infrastructure where you can defend your margins and your pricing and your brand equity, you're going to be devoured by the online. So that's the second point. If the future of brands, as I said, is physical, brand equity, experience, definition, that's more pronounced than before. The next thing would be expectations of the consumer are rapidly growing at a cost to the retailers. So if you look at Klarna, the Swedish buy now, pay later card, in its simplest form, it's ingenious because it's reducing friction. So I can order 25 items, have them all shipped, select one or none, ship everything back, and I don't pay for anything, except depending on the retailer, the shipping, until I've confirmed purchase of an item. So as a consumer, why wouldn't I jump to do that? As a retailer, that's another cost I have to bear. The idea that I'm now providing a float on the merchandise to the customer rather than charging the 25 items to a credit card and giving a refund 30 or 45 days later, whatever it happens to be. So another trend is that brands that fail to have, or retailers, even more decisively than brands, that fail to have a clear point of view and a clear purpose, but are running on the momentum of history, the inertial momentum of history, are going to die much faster than they were going to before COVID.
Okay.
Or they're going to be massively constructed, aggressively reconstructed much faster. And brands who are in the middle maybe do have a point of view, but are neither as efficient at delivering great product and design at some rational price, or delivering extremely efficient product and design at some incredibly attractive price. They're being battered, particularly now. But that was a trend that's been ongoing. And then finally, I would say, when you talked about leadership, where is leadership coming from? There's not a merchant, generally speaking, running any retailer any longer. There are financial people, preponderance,
a lot of consultants.
A lot of consultants. So what does the leadership look like? I've had the privilege of sitting in a room with a digital platform team and a luxury brand team. And the luxury brand team is speaking Italian, and the digital platform team is speaking computer programming, and it might as well be Martian. There's no connection.
There's no connection. Yeah.
So what constitutes leadership for an Amazon platform, by definition, will be an uneasy fit with the leadership of let's call it a higher end position brand platform. And then when you go to how do you run a business? How does one run a business with what used to be 450 stores in the UK? To give you an example, that brand today would have how many stores in the UK? 60?
Yeah.
7?
Yeah.
But how do you run
72 is always a number that gets talked about in the UK for these things, but exactly.
But and how does that person run those 72 stores? And another, they're what, 45 in France, and it's very messy. And the attempt to get scale through physical distribution is more complicated than ever. And I think that most of these firms, most of these brands are run by people who came out of the way they traditionally were built, which was to manufacture things that were wholesaled to retailers, to multi-brands, to department stores, to others. And that piece is being squeezed out, and the brands have to have a different kind of leadership team. It's no longer that's not good enough. There needs to be an agile response, and that requires a leadership of a team, which is not really. There are lots of examples of teams in retail, but it's really one person giving instructions and highly competent people executing.
It's a command and control kind of model in many respects. It has been. Perhaps that's not agile enough for what we currently need. I mean, we're tracking the Q&A quite nicely here, because Alex Connick in Oxford says, what about, is offline shopping now sustainable? That takes us into the experience question. You mentioned experience a number of times. Indeed, the title of the conversation around Sparkle, sort of tries to capture that notion of experience. With people queuing, with face masks, with social distancing, what does experience look like? And is there a challenge for physical stores to create enjoyable experience as we emerge from lockdown? And longer term, you kind of hinted that the middle ground is losing its way in respect of experience. How's luxury retail placed in relation to this? Can luxury retail provide the richness of experience, the assurance of experience that it could have done pre-COVID?
Well, I think there are two ways to think about answering that question. The first is to say it's more sustainable than online, because online generates a lot more packaging and cardboard
Yep.
that has to be somehow recycled and the returns. Yep. And so one can run, in some sense, a more responsible business with a physical infrastructure that is not based only on scale. The second way to answer that question, I think, is that offline or physical retail distribution will absolutely remain. For a variety of reasons, the evidence is clear that there is an appeal for that, but it will be more towards population centers, towards tourism hubs, towards places where people would choose to go. By the way, that might be a remote spot on the coast of Brava where there's a restaurant. People from around the world are booking 6 to 9 months in advance or a year and a half in advance. That's a specific example. But so people choose to go for a reason. And as the transcendentalists said, the journey is more important than the destination. So there's something about the quality of experience that can be delivered through a physical point of contact that embraces the five senses, that creates memories, that challenges emotions. So what are the emotions of flagship experience? We focus on shopping, but we could talk about other forms of flagship experience. But the first baseline in today's world is trust. We live in an environment where there's extraordinary transparency. There's a high degree of noise, often fake news types of noise, confusion, rumor. We have very high levels of expectations constantly growing higher on the part of consumers, guests. And certainly the focus in the US and the question from New Orleans, there's this idea that you're going to get sued. That's a big issue, in fact, for the recovery of these various economies is, will you, Jonathan, if you send a colleague on a trip to a conference, run the risk of being sued personally or organizationally if that person catches coronavirus sometime during that trip? Now, that sounds a little bit far-fetched sitting in some parts of the world, but that's why so many big U.S. companies or U.S.-based companies have been cutting way back on travel. You send someone to the hotel, the person somehow gets ill. How are you liable morally, financially, legally? So I think what will happen is there's a period where there was pent-up demand. You and I were discussing this on consumption and experience. Absolutely clear. It's been in every market of our 11 markets. We've seen it again and again. Then there's almost a retooling of the infrastructure to address. We are not seeing in our locations perspex screens, but people are putting those up in classrooms or in takeaway restaurants in central London, but different ways of limiting physical crowding and access. That will shrink away. And I think what will happen is, as the vaccines emerge, and it seems fairly clear they will, and it will take a period of time for them to be manufactured and distributed, what will people keep with them from this moment? One piece definitely will be hostility towards the establishment and anger towards institutions. Another, that will be called a social issue, and that will translate through, I think, in lots of ways in terms of brands and goods. A brand can be a university, a brand can be a company manufacturing product, a brand can be a sports team. But I think that's one big trend. The second trend will be the remaining disappearance of middle ground. Financial investors and sponsors won't want to touch something that doesn't have a clear role in the economic hierarchy of an economy. A third will be the idea. Sorry, I'm just going to get the noise here.
Got some great bird song actually outside your window. Scott,
getting the lawnmowers coming next.
Oh, right, okay.
But a third will be what's an acceptable level of contact, conversation, touch in a store environment. And again, after trust, the most powerful emotion is I'll be provocative and use the word love, right? The item, the memory of the item, the gift. This is something about a deeper emotion than a transaction. So the internet is about transaction, and physical experiences, flagship experience, is about heightened emotions, and they will become more important because the reality is, the more I buy online, the more time I have, the more freedom I have. At some level, the less money I have available in my proverbial pocket to do really special things, and I'll be looking for really special things.
Let me broaden that out a little bit. Oh, you're just going to close that window. Very good. Let me broaden that out a little bit. We've had a couple of questions in that look at a broader kind of issue around sustainability. One question here is: COVID is being compared to a war, and sacrifices have had to be made as a result. Have you seen or experienced any negative feedback or reaction to a luxury product for a few at a time when people are dying? And there's another observation here: lockdowns in many geographies have given us a cleaner air, a greater sense of our local community and our impact on the world in the context of climate change in particular. Do you think that the affluent need to lead the way in shaping consumption messages? And what are the implications for luxury retail for those kinds of observations?
I think collectively we must respond to events. That's a reality. I think that brands have always focused on this issue, have always been responsive relative to many other kinds of organizations, because by collection, by quarter of the year, they have to come up with something new that reflects the mood and the sentiment of the moment. And that's stylistic, it's maybe composition of fabric and materials. It might be themes about geography and nationalities. So Marvin Traub created these festivals. Bloomingdale's, New York, became famous for festivals of India, of different parts of the world. The very first one was built around Britannia going and anchoring in New York Harbor, and the Queen and Prince Philip coming up in a ticker tape parade to open a celebration of Britain at Bloomingdale's. So I think that the challenges most organizations are led by, and I don't mean this to sound overly provocative, they're led by talented, intelligent people with fantastic records of success as conformists. People are promoted for performing well within the confines, within the structure of an organization. When all the rules are changing abruptly and continuously, the leadership of these organizations normally isn't prepared for that. Life hasn't prepared them for that. They haven't been selected or self-selected for that. And I think that's what we're facing for the next 5 years, 3 to 5 years. So it will be more volatile than, it will feel and be more volatile even than it needs to be as a result of all of this.
Can I add another kind of sort of disruption into this, which is what we've, I guess, tended to call these deglobalization tendencies, which the pandemic is accentuating clearly through the curtailing of international travel and so on. But we're also seeing tariff disputes. We're seeing retail supply chains disrupted because of that. And we've seen perhaps, kind of move towards onshoring rather than offshoring, and the sort of lack of connectedness that the world is experiencing. How have you, as in terms of the value retail position, how have you as a business sought to address some of those sorts of trends, if you recognize them in your decision making?
Well, something like onshoring, it's absolutely happening. Larry Summers, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, forecast this 9 years ago. He said supply chain risk was real. Costs of delivery through manufacturing were going down in the West because of mechanization. And he expected that onshoring would mean manufacturing at home, but without a net increase in jobs. That was his forecast, which I think largely has turned out to be logical. And if if one thinks about responding to changes, meeting demand, wouldn't it be great to have everything a day away rather than a month away, or delivered less in a less costly form, in terms of sustainability or economics? So I think we're in that, again, that world, that moment where the agility to embrace reinvention is required. And we're lucky enough to be at a point where if the rules are being ripped up, if the system is being disrupted, we have the opportunity to grow by adapting to that. So I'll give you the example of the digital queuing.
Oh, yeah.
We tested it 5 weeks ago in Germany. We opened up first in Germany. We arrived with it in hand at Bicester Village a week ago when we opened. The first couple of hours, there was congestion and confusion as people tried to adapt in part to the fact that there were no queues going to be allowed. And the brands themselves found that different to what they were used to. Even if they'd done it with the same brand, might have worked with us in Germany to do it, their local teams and their regional leadership hadn't seen it yet. There was a huge amount of pushback, including within our own organization, because there is this bias towards doing what's known and trusted, even if it's intellectually clear that it's not the right thing to do. Emotionally, there's resistance. Yeah. But the fact is, we are today 100% digital queuing in Europe, five weeks after we tested the app.
Wow.
And we didn't write our own app. We didn't do all that. We tried to avoid, based on necessity, the traps that could block one.
So you persuaded each of your partner brands to use the same app for digital queuing, in effect, in the village.
So we provide access to an app that works. And we have a very high-end jewelry brand in one of our villages. It's using a different model with a different kind of almost a reservations app, because if the average price of an item being sold is much higher than a normal fashion item might be, they wanted to create a curated experiential touch.
Yeah, and that really gives a personalized experience for the customer.
Which is fine.
Yeah.
The point is that there can't be a queue outside their front door.
Yeah. So we've got about 8 minutes left, surprisingly. I mean, it's gone really quickly. I wanted to pick up some of the points you mentioned about leadership. And you talked about, conformists having led many retail businesses up till now, and the need for greater agility. Can I also perhaps prompt you to talk a bit about what kind of leaders will retailing post-COVID actually require in terms of skills and capabilities? Do they need to empower their local teams more, for example?
So when I talk about conformists, I'd like to clarify that I think in general, the conformity is driven by financial expectations.
Yes.
That the leadership in retail has often been selected by people who are reflecting the interest of investors, public company investors. None of that's wrong, but one can see a series of train wrecks in the quoted sector now in touching retail that are unnecessary. So it's a cycle. You have executives, you have a board, you have stakeholders, but very strongly speaking, institutional investors. And I believe that when all of those people selected pre-COVID agree, it's definitely the wrong answer, right? Because they were aligned with a view of the world that's no longer accurate, and they were selected because the goal was perpetuating the status quo rather than disrupting and reinventing the norm. That's not true in tech. That's not true in attempts to retail online, but traditional retail organizations still are dominated by either a successful autocrat who may or may not be able to rebalance and adjust in this environment efficiently and decisively. And if he or she may or may not be able to get the teams in those organizations to respond because it's such a complex moment.
Yeah.
Or what I think realistically should be termed committees. And committees are a failure for running anything. And the committee today is the board, the senior leadership team, having endless conversations that don't get anywhere decisive. I'm giving you an example of this logic, but I've had calls from brands. I have to sit there for an hour while I'm given the prepared speech about why landlords, I don't consider myself a landlord, have to be flexible. The brand is struggling, this, that,
Yeah.
the other.
Yeah.
Every single factual statement made, I've just had to go through one of these this week, does not apply to us. But the board has hired a consultant, has hired a restructuring expert. The consultant and the restructuring expert are telling the management team, you must go to every landlord and give this canned presentation. The management team, meanwhile, is not running the business. The consultants and the restructuring teams are intelligent people, but nothing that's said to me in a meeting reflects the specific relationship they have with our company, our service, our pricing. They're in there telling me why turnover linked payments are the requirement of survival for the brand, ignoring the fact that we've maybe been with them for 15 years.
Yeah.
And the management team they're not rolling their eyes, but they're smiling politely, knowing the whole thing is completely illogical.
Completely false. Yeah, yeah.
But they're not going to tell the board and the consultants and these Reddit people dropped in with expertise.
Yeah.
And these companies are going to go to the wall. There's not a question, right? If this is the way they're approaching today, they're dead tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's the committee approach.
Yeah.
And I think the team-based approach is something about assembling a group that is able, and some of this is based on history of working together already, able to work responsibly, talk every morning, talk every evening, constantly adjust, constantly reinvent, and accept that everything's going fine in country A, and suddenly you're told that the social distancing norms are not going down from 2 meters to 1 meter or being removed, they're being reintroduced. What are you going to do then? Or suddenly, and this happened to us, somebody's partner, spouse started a hate campaign online because actually this person was resentful that the partner was going to work every day in a brand owned boutique that happened to be represented with us. How do you react and respond in an appropriate way? These are things we're not used to dealing with. We haven't had to address them before. But I think teamwork comes from people relinquishing, I would say relinquishing authority, but not empowering control, because then you just get back to the committee idea. So it's defining roles. And I would think we're talking about retail companies, but I think the same is true for Oxford University. The same is true for...
I quite agree. The university's bureaucracy, which has thrived for 900 years on committees. I'm glad to see it's not doing that at the moment.
These are wonderful moments, again, perhaps, to be in a university setting where the university has decided it's required to adjust, because it creates all sorts of freedom. Yeah.
Well, Scott, we're near at the end of our time, and I could go on for a lot longer because it's a fascinating conversation to be having. So I haven't taken nearly enough questions from the audience. We've managed, I think, 2 or 3, but there are 4 or 5 here which really merit a response. But we've had contributors from Pakistan, India, Japan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Australia, up early, China, listening to us today. So thank you so much for taking part in this. Let me promote the next webinar in our series. If you're keen for more, then the next offering is on Thursday at, again, the same time, 2 o'clock BST UK time. We'll be debating one of the great controversies in business today, stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism. And I'm sure, Scott, you'll have some views on that. Hosted by Oxford side Professor Renee Adams. On one side of the debate will be Professor Lucian Bebchuk at the Harvard Law School, and on the other, Oxford's own Professor Colin Mayer. So, Scott, I know you're ex-Harvard, you're also involved in Oxford, so you've got to choose a side, I guess. But looking forward to that debate. But in the meantime, let me take the chance again to thank you, Scott, enormously for giving up an hour of your time at such a busy moment for the business, for sharing such great insights with us. And just remains for me to thank the audience for tuning in and to say stay safe and stay well. Thank you.